Plants. Okay, we're getting into plants now, my dear Levitt. So the story of plants starts here in this murky, disgusting aquarium, but it actually serves a good purpose because the story of plants starts with algae. It starts with those protists that are really frustrating because they're hard to categorize. Remember, most protists are unicellular, except for some of these algae ones where they spend a lot of their life as unicellular protists, but then they sort of get together and turn into these photosynthetic structures. Leaves, essentially, but they're not leaves. They don't have any of the structures that leaves do. They're sort of cells together that can float together and absorb light. Now, you'll notice there's 3 different colors of algae. There's red, brown, and green algae. Most likely that the brown algae were sort of the first ones, maybe the big ones, and those live a little bit deeper in the ocean. And the reason they're brown is they have a different type of chlorophyll, and chlorophyll, remember, is the thing that does photosynthesis. So plants, big thing that they do is photosynthesis, right? These guys here, they need these special lights so that these plants can grow and do photosynthesis. So remember, photosynthesis is, there's a pigment called chlorophyll. Its electrons get excited. It releases the electrons. That helps it make ATP, which releases oxygen and then can go to the Krebs cycle and make sugars. Now, chlorophyll is sensitive to certain wavelengths of light. Deeper in the ocean, only a few wavelengths of light make it in that deep into the ocean. So blue and green get absorbed, and red sort of gets reflected. Hence, plants that live deeper are red. That's the kind of chlorophyll that absorbs the blue and green. And as you go further, different wavelengths get absorbed, and the plants, the algae that lives on the top, it has that type of chlorophyll that just reflects the green and absorbs the red wavelengths and the blue wavelengths. And so hence it's green. And those algae live on the surface of the water. And they can float. They don't have to really hold themselves up. They don't have to worry about drying out. But I imagine that over time, that top layer of the water got pretty crowded. They were also probably blocking the light for the guys below. So it's not so great being the guys below. You want to be the guys up on top, floating on top, being green. And probably a lot of them would get washed up onto the shore. And eventually, they started to evolve ways to live on the land. So plants had to adapt. First, they started, those algae became more and more complicated as they lived in the water, became more and more complicated water plants. And then eventually they became more, and then they eventually moved onto the land. So we start with algae, and we very quickly, so there's the green algae that lives on the surface of the waters, brown algae lives just under the water, and then red algae lives the deepest. So let's talk about some of the adaptations that plants had to make to live on the water. So number one, the challenge, or live on land. So the challenges of living on land is you need support. So you need to be secured to the ground so you don't blow away. In the water, you can float wherever you like. But on land, you don't want to be blown away into the mud, into the shade. So the first plants, which we'll call bryophytes and mosses. So those are the first kind of types of plants that evolved first, bryophytes and mosses. And they didn't have roots. They had what's called a rhizoid. And it's just a little thing to hang on to. Now, algae also they have what's called a little hold fast. So they also algae could hold on to rocks if they didn't get washed away. They had a little rhizoid that they would hang on to rock, a little hold fast. And the earliest plants had an adaptation of that as just a little, almost like roots, but it doesn't do anything. It just anchors stuff. Roots have more function than that. It makes bryophytes actually really good at colonizing new areas in hard soils like rocky rocks and things like that, because they don't actually have a big root system that goes deep into the ground. They can just attach themselves to rocks. So if you look around where we live, you'll find that there's a lot of mosses and a lot of bryophytes. And if you go down to the water near the ocean, you're going to find a lot of mosses and things hanging on to rocks. So that was the first thing, is they needed support. They also needed to be upright and to face the sun. So algae can have air bladders so they can float on top of the water, but plants couldn't do that. So they had to get sturdier and stronger than just loosey-goosey algae and kind of water plants. The other thing that plants have to worry about is dehydrating. Remember, the Krebs cycle requires water. You need water. You need water for all kinds of metabolism, right? You need to do dehydration, synthesis, and hydrolysis. And hydrolysis is the thing that requires water. And so keeping in water is important. So plants needed ways to keep themselves from dehydrating. So they started to develop waxy surface. Plant cells have that big vacuole that contains water. And the other problem is they have to reproduce. Plants have to be able to reproduce. And plants reproduce sexually, and they have a really weird life cycle. Plants have a very strange life cycle. When you look at a plant, you're looking at just one part of its life cycle. They have something called Alternation of Generations, which we're going to get into. There's this assignment, a worksheet assignment that's going to come up that's going to help you explain and work out this alternation of generations. So plants, they're going to be exposed to the sun, which promotes them drying out, but they need the sun because they need it for photosynthesis to make their food. They have to exchange gases with the air, right? They produce oxygen, so they have to get that oxygen out, and they have to take in carbon dioxide because they use that carbon dioxide to make sugars. So they need to be open to the air, but not too open, because then all the water will leave and they're going to dry out and won't be able to have metabolism. And they need to be able to reproduce. So they actually have sperm, and early plants have sperm and eggs, which need to float in water, because those first plants that lived in the ocean, they didn't have to worry about drying out, and they could just shoot their sperm everywhere and shoot their eggs everywhere. They would just float and meet wherever they did. But on land, how do you do that? So plants evolved over time complex methods of dispersing their sperm and their eggs. And you also have to disperse your sperm and your eggs far away enough so that you don't interbreed. Remember, we talked about, I'm pretty sure we talked about in this class, why incest is so bad. So plants, they don't want to do incest either, right? You don't want to have the mutations from the mother and the father of the air coming together. You want to have that variability for evolution. We definitely talked about that. So those are the challenges of living on land. You need to disperse, you need to prevent dehydration, and you need support. So as we go through the different groups of plants, think about how plants over time evolved those adaptations and got better and better. What are we supposed to cover today? Where's my little list? Intro to plants. Algae, bryophytes. Okay, well, let's talk about bryophytes. So bryophytes were the first ones. So there's those mosses. They're very small. They did not grow, they did not evolve a lot of ways to support. They don't have specialized structures. They're sort of just leafy. They just have the photosynthetic material, but they didn't evolve stems to hold them up. So they're low to the ground. They have that little rhizoid to hang on, just barely to hang on to the ground. They grow in next to each other. And when they reproduce, they haven't figured out any complex methods, or they haven't evolved any complex methods of dispersing their sperm and stuff. They basically need a very wet environment because their sperm are just like the plants that lived in the water. They need to float in the water. The eggs and the sperm need to float in the water. So things that they've evolved for support, they don't require a lot of soil. They just anchor to the rocks with those rhizoids. They're leafy. They don't have a hard stem. So the evolution of those things is minor. They're barely adapted for land. How they deal with dehydration, what they've evolved for dehydration, well, they're very absorptive, so they can absorb a lot of water. They have those big their cells have those vacuoles, so they can hold onto water. But other than that, their big adaptation for dehydrating is they live in the shade. So moss, you'll find it in the shade. You're supposed to be able to, when you're lost in the woods, to find north by looking at trees and the north side of trees, because that's the side that doesn't get the sun, especially in the northern, when we're where we are in the northern hemisphere, the sun shines on the southern side of trees. That would dry out moss too much. So the north side of trees is going to have moss on it. I don't know how good that method for finding north is. So they hold water. They live in wet, shady areas. That's their big adaptation. And they don't have any what's called vascular tissue. So plants, as we go into the future and plants develop more, they have tissues that they can push nutrients in and out. Here, these plants can't. The way they disperse nutrients and water and food and whatever through their bodies is through diffusion. It just diffuses. So it just goes from higher concentration to lower concentration. So as a result, there's a limit to how big those plants can be. Diffusion can only cover so much. They have specialized structures. So they have an antheridium and an archegonium. Archegonium, it produces the female gamete. Antheridium produces the sperm, the male gamete. And both of these have to swim. So they release these and then they swim and make more. Now, let's talk about this life cycle, this alternation of generations. So that all began with some of those protists, some of those algae. They had this thing called alternation of generations. There's going to be a worksheet on it. And some key things about alternation of generations. Basically, you've got two processes happening, meiosis and mitosis. And we learned about mitosis, that's cell division. When cells divide, that's mitosis. And you get an exact copy of all the genome, right? We learned about genome in evolution. So you get a copy of the genome. You get all the pairs of chromosomes. Meiosis is you get copies, but the end result is only half the genome. So that's when you make sex cells, when you make sperm, when you make eggs. So plants do this, except they actually will have when you have both sets of chromosomes, so you've done mitosis, you've got both sets of chromosomes, that's called being diploid. Those cells are diploid. And it's recorded as 2N. Oh, 2N. That's diploid. Here's an example, diploid. When you do meiosis and you have half the chromosomes, you still are functioning. You still have all the genetic material, right? You still have all the genes. You just don't have the other alleles, the other versions of the genes. That's called being haploid. Half the genes, haploid, or not half the genes, half the chromosomes. So plants, what they do is they exist as a diploid and a haploid organism during their life cycle. So imagine you could grow into you and be haploid, have half the cells, and then later in your life cycle, you would turn diploid. Be weird, but that's what plants do. So let's look at this is the bryophyte life cycle, right? Yes. So where should we start with it? Oops. Well, let's just start with a female and a male. So you have a male plant, a female plant, and they will produce, a female plant will produce an egg, and a male plant will produce sperm. The female will produce the gametes in an archegonium. Male will produce it in something called the arthuridium. And the process that makes these, the sperm and the egg, is meiosis. So meiosis will produce haploid sperm and eggs. Now, the female plant and the male plant are haploid. That's also important. So they will release those sperm and the egg. They will swim. They will come together, and then is a process called fertilization. When you have fertilization, you go from haploid to diploid. You make a zygote. And a zygote will grow into a sporophyte. Okay? The sporophyte grows on top of this stage, which is haploid, gametophyte. Gametophyte produces gametes, sporophyte produces spores. It's going to get crazy. It's going to get crazy, kids. This is for bryophytes. So the sporophyte grows on top of the bryophyte gametophyte. I know, this is so crazy. And then it produces through meiosis, so it goes from being 2N, diploid, to being 1N, and it releases the spores. The spores just land on the ground. They start to do mitosis, so cell division, and they grow into male and female gametophytes. The gametophytes are haploid. Then those haploid cells produce sperm and egg. The sperm and egg come together. They become diploid. They form a zygote, which is like a baby that divides and grows into a sporophyte. And in bryophytes, the sporophyte lives off, it's actually a parasite on the gametophyte. It actually sucks up the nutrients from the gametophyte. So when you're looking at mosses and you see the plants, you're actually looking at the gametophytes. You're looking at haploid plants. That's what bryophytes are, is they're haploid plants. They only have half the chromosomes. What's the danger of having half the chromosomes? Well, you're less resilient to mutations, to mutagens, right? Because you don't have the two copies, the two alleles of each gene. If while you're growing something goes wrong, you don't have those backups. So very quickly, plants started to evolve that the dominant form went from being the gametophyte. Here the gametophyte is the dominant form. When you look at moss, you're seeing gametophytes haploid, which are haploid. They evolved to the sporophyte being the dominant form. So when you look at these plants, the sporophyte, which is diploid, is the one that we associate with it being the plant. And that's the next grouping of plants, which is ferns. So things to remember, just we've introduced, so we'll talk about ferns. I think we'll talk about ferns tomorrow because this is a huge amount already. So just remember, sporophyte, gametophyte. Gametophytes, haploid, half the chromosomes. Sporophytes, both sets of chromosomes, diploid. Sporophytes use meiosis. At the end of meiosis, you become haploid to release spores that then, through mitosis, grow into gametophyte, produce a gamete, again through mitosis because they only have half the things. And then the gametes come together, fertilization makes a zygote, and the cycle continues on and on. So I'm going to post a worksheet now. It's on the alternation of generations, and it gives you a preview because it talks about all the different groups, and it talks about how they sort of evolve, their life cycles evolve, because this worksheet is about the life cycle of plants. Things to note. Eventually, plants evolve a way of dispersing their sperm so that it doesn't need water. It doesn't have to be all moist all the time. Ferns still need water, but then as you get into trees, as you get into gymnosperms, they evolve pollen. Pollen is basically sperm. It's a way of carrying sperm, except it's no longer sperm anymore, because when we think of sperm, we think of flagella and stuff, but here pollen don't have flagella. But it's a way of carrying the male gamete, so that haploid male gamete, to the female. And so trees evolved cones, male and female cones, and the gametes can fly on the wind. Male gamete, the pollen can fly on the wind. Angiosperms, which is the most evolved plants, and the plants that evolved with us, with animals, instead of using wind, they do use wind, they can send their pollen on pollinators. So pollinators are carrying, for the plants, they're carrying the male gamete. So bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, they all evolved along, they co-evolved along with plants to carry the plant male gamete to the female. Okay, so do that worksheet, and we'll talk about ferns and other things tomorrow. Is there any ferns in this room? There are no ferns in this room. It's okay. Okay, there you go. This is your introduction to plants. Plants are weird, but they're really cool-ish. No, they're cool. They're cool.